Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Lykke Li called So Sad, So Sexy. So a few weeks back when I reviewed the newest album from Churches, I called out how the majority of the production issues of that album were endemic to the producer Greg Kurstin, a talented producer that's got an unfortunate habit of swallowing his mixes and reverb and emphasizing percussion over the melody. He's done this a lot before. But you know what? I would be remiss to not call out the moments where his approach actually does work. And there's one example that I always go back to, 2014's I Never Learned by Lykke Li, a bleakly emotive breakup album that somehow sustains some real melodic hooks amidst all the hollow darkness that might not have been the follow-up guaranteed to get mainstream attention after I Follow Rivers snagged some attention in 2011 and wound up on the Hot 100, but that wasn't really necessary. It got a lot of critical acclaim and for good reason. To this day, I consider I Never Learned as Lykke Li's most potent, cohesive, and emotionally gripping project to date. One record where Greg Kurstin's production seemed to really fit and was not overexposed at that time. And thus, I can't help but see a certain irony that 4 years later, just like Lily Allen did for her newest album, No Shame, a project that's destined for the trailing edge, stay tuned for it there, Lykke Li ditched Greg Kurstin for her new album, So Sad, So Sexy, for a much bigger production team. And I'll admit I was a little bit concerned about this one, seemingly like the mainstream adjacent follow-up 7 years later, incorporating elements of R&B and trap with rap guest features. This is about the furthest thing that I was expecting from Lykke Li, but you know what? I won't deny that I wasn't curious. So, alright, what do we get with So Sad, So Sexy? Well, this is a disappointment. Pretty big one, as a matter of fact. And for a while, I thought I would just put this on the trailing edge and move on to other albums that are more interesting and unique. But the more listens I gave So Sad, So Sexy, the more I felt that I really had to give it a full review to justify my time, even if I'm going to wind up keeping this fairly brief. So here it is. I'm not quite sure I would call this album a sellout for Lykke Li, but it is absolutely a departure from her more richly compelling indie pop sound to something that seems to fit somewhere between Lana Del Rey and your average mainstream R&B starlet that you forget after one album. And while Lykke Li can be a more thoughtful songwriter than both typically are, So Sad, So Sexy, it's a considerable step down below her usual quality. Hell, I'd probably say this is her weakest album to date. And a key component with this explaining why that happens, it starts off with the framing, because Lykke Li has always leaned into abstraction, or lyrics that can seem broadly sketched in comparison with her more emotive, raw delivery. And one of the reasons why I Never Learned could leverage that to her advantage was because the production alternated between cavernous depth and pickups that were almost uncomfortably raw and intimate. It got really close, it got really intense. It was an album that leaned a lot harder on her performance and had production to intensify and amplify that outside of writing that might feel a little bit thin out of that context. And yet across the board, So Sad, So Sexy steps away from that and becomes most immediately noticeable in Lykke Li's performance. What was once sounding so raw is traded for something bleary-eyed and kind of detached, which some critics have snidely called sad girl pop, and unfortunately the descriptor can feel kind of apt. And while the thick multi-tracking is still often present here, it's pressed through these flattened and warping layers to add an intoxicated texture to a lot of the vocals that not only fails to capture any sort of sensuality or glamour or sexiness, but also fails to disguise how utterly underwhelming a lot of her delivery is. Hell, there are songs where some of her breathy cooing could have worked, but that would require remotely consistent vocal mixing and fidelity, or in some cases just ensuring the vocal texture doesn't pop out in the mix. An unfortunate issue carrying over from I Never Learned, and substantially less excusable here given how hard this record is trying to cultivate pop R&B elegance with so many other producers who should really know better. And that's before you factor in the pitch shifting and the poor sample blending, and then you wind up with a messier project just from a production standpoint. But somehow it gets even worse, because while Greg Kurstin might have been able to accentuate that strong core melody within the reverb of I Never Learned, always make sure that we actually have a hook at the forefront, that's been swapped out with overweight percussion and trap snares and a play for mainstream attention that ignores how it renders so much of this album a lot less memorable. The only hooks that really stuck with me were the title track track and Bad Woman, and that had more to do with the vocal melody line than anything in the instrumental, which is still often just as washed out, and often becoming a lot more distinctive for half-formed ideas that don't work in comparison with the ones that do, like the extremely sloppy interplay with the snares and the vocals on Hard Rain, or the ugly, oily warbles all over the hook of Jaguars in the Air, or the sloppy percussion mixing on Deep End and Last Piece, the former which actually had some potential if the synthesizers could stay on key for once. So yeah, okay. None of this is a good sign if we're weighing this record against any mainstream modern indie pop or R&B in performance or production. It's basically reminiscent of a Tove Lo album with less momentum and worse mixing, and that's saying something. So, can Lykke Li's lyrics save the album? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, I've always liked her framing and the utterly toxic hookups and relationships strewn around this album. They sound about as unpleasant as they probably are in real life, and I guess the production emphasizes that, especially when it's clear that there might be some element of genuine feeling highlighted in Hard Rain and Better Alone and even the title track that keeps her coming back to this guy. And while I'm not really sure Last Piece and Utopia really fit in with the album, surrounding Lykke Li's new struggles with having a child and balancing that with her art, at least Utopia ends on a somewhat optimistic note looking forward, and I can kind of appreciate that. But there are two big problems with the writing, and the first that it can be really hard to invest any emotions in the melodrama here, as neither character, be it Lykke Li or her partner, is all that sympathetic or portrays much in the way of depth. Two Nights, prime example. It's a depressed song that leaves Lykke Li yearning for her partner to come home late at night as she suspects that he's cheating, but then Aminé, of all people, shows up for a guest verse to flat out admit that he is cheating, and then call Lykke Li out on not investing in the relationship. And while it does provide some unique balance to the situation, the fact that similar situations keep happening across the rest of this album on songs like the title track and Sex, Money, Feelings, Die and Bad Woman and Better Alone, and it kind of makes me hard for me to care about the stories here, especially when there is kids in the background. There's a lot less of a thematic arc in comparison with, say, I Never Learn, and with this kind of storytelling, that's a bit of a problem. And the second problem I've already alluded to, in the absence of swell or bombast to elevate lyrics that can feel underwritten, even coming off of I Never Learn, there's very little beyond good framing that makes the writing here all that memorable or distinctive, especially when she actively starts recycling metaphors, either the cigarettes strewn across the album or the rain from her last record. I mean, say what you will about Lana Del Rey, I have through a number of reviews, who could probably even learn something about emotional nuance coming from Lykke Li in performance and writing, but at least Lana Del Rey can paint something of a unique picture with her lyrics. There's more flair and style, it's more memorable than this. But as a whole, okay, look, I'm amazed I found so much to say about So Sad, So Sexy altogether, but the more listens I gave it, the more it felt like a complete misstep towards a mainstream style that feels jarring and unnatural for someone like her. She doesn't need to be singing songs like Sex, Money, Feelings, Die that feels like a bad Instagram caption. I'd be charitable and call this transitional, but transitioning to what? I have no idea. I certainly hope it's not more of this or going in that direction. For me, very light 5 out of 10 and only recommended to the diehard fans at best, but it's probably her weakest project to date, and I cannot see remembering enough of this project to either like or dislike it long term. Just saying, you've been warned. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know it's pretty harsh on this, but coming off I Never Learn, this was such a disappointment, and I want to make sure this was in writing somewhere beyond just the trailing edge where you actually got some visibility. But you want to buy it, links down there below. Got the poll up there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am, although in this case, I'm not sure I am. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, the link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to talk about albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to add to my schedule. Want to see my schedule? It's linked down on my Instagram, down there below. But until next time, I've got Dierks Bentley coming up, just don't worry, it's coming. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.